I'm Chikodi.
I'm Jenny.
Welcome, and you are?
Thank you. So I'm Nicola Collett
Thank
from
you.
Montfort University. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for coming. Let's not forget Doctor.
Yes,
Doctor,
yeah.
Doctor, right.
It still feels weird.
Yeah.
Really?
Dr.
When
Nicola
did you get that title officially?
Officially, it would have been last October.
Oh,
Wow.
wow.
So yeah, it's still pretty fresh.
Amazing.
Where was that? At the Montfort
Oh my
University?
God.
So no, so my PhD was at Keele University, which is North Staffordshire
Okay.
area.
Oh, wow.
Are you originally from Leicester or?
So originally from near Peterborough.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and then moved up towards Stoke for
Okay.
university, and then moved here for work. So very much a Midlands
Oh,
girl.
Oh.
Wow. Well, please introduce yourself. Tell us
Yeah.
a bit about yourself, your background. That'll be
Okay. Yes, as I said, my name is Nicola and I'm a lecturer in community and criminal justice at De Montfort University. Been there for just over four years now.
Okay.
And I've, as I said, just completed my PhD, which took a fair while.
Really?
But we got there, yeah. So just finished the PhD, which is all around criminal records and living with a criminal record.
Okay.
And I'm part of the collateral consequences for criminal records working group.
Okay.
So that's an academic working group in affiliation with the European Society of Criminology. So trying to get that kind of not just national reach and understanding of criminal records on the topic, but larger still. So yeah, kind of.
What made you decide to do a PhD, and why did you choose that specialism, criminal records? Because it's quite specific.
Yeah, it is. It is. What a question. Why did I decide to do a PhD? The question that I asked myself for about probably every few months for 6 years while I was doing it. Why did I do this? No.
Oh wow.
So originally, so obviously studying criminology. That was just purely out of interest. I get angry and things wind me up.
Okay.
Issues around social injustice, things not being fair, really annoy me. And criminology gave me the language, gave me access to kind of research and the kind of skills that I needed to be able to articulate why I was angry about things and why things didn't sit right with me. And the kind of topic of criminal records, that kind of came from when I was doing my master's degree, which was also at Keele University. I worked for a charity called Leaders Unlocked.
Okay.
And they had these youth commission projects. And I was the project coordinator at first for the Staffordshire Youth Commission and then the Cheshire Youth Commission. And what it was a group of, I think it was 14 to 25-year-olds who lived in that local area, so Staffordshire and then Cheshire. And it was funded by the police and crime commissioners, and the idea is we identified key topics, so potentially knife crime, hate crime, perhaps sexual violence, whatever it was that the young people believed were key topics at that time. And we went and did workshops. And those workshops, sometimes we went into schools and colleges, so mainstream education providers. But we also went into kind of alternative education providers, so perhaps young people who were excluded or perhaps just weren't engaging with mainstream education. We went into different LGBT groups, Prince's Trust, went into a couple of young offenders as well. And through that process, the thing that stuck out to me wasn't actually about any of the key priorities set by the young people in the group. It was the difference between going into mainstream education and hearing young people talk about criminals and talking about these individuals who choose to do bad things and choose to harm others and therefore require punishment. And then going into some of the alternative provisions and hearing the experiences of people who had already interacted with the criminal justice system for a range of reasons, right? And at the time, I must have been, I think I was kind of 21 maybe at the time, maybe 21, 22. And I was talking to people who were younger than me, maybe 19, 18, saying, what's the point?
What's the point of
any of this anymore, right? So I have a criminal record. I'm going
okay,
nowhere.
yeah. Oh, right, yeah.
Up,
Yeah.
And I was there going, God, like, don't get me wrong, I've done things in my past that absolutely could have given me a criminal record, and I'm quite open about that. To me, a criminal record isn't about who's committed crime and who hasn't. It's who was perhaps being watched and monitored, perhaps from kind of, I mean, we know that people from looked after backgrounds are subject to more kind of close monitoring and therefore are more likely to be caught, right?
That's right.
And I started to really think, wow, what privilege have I got? And I'm here doing my master's degree. I had no intention of doing a PhD at that point. That kind of just started happening. And I thought, God, I'm doing a master's degree. My future looks pretty positive right now, and I feel like I've got options and opportunities. And I'm talking to people several years younger than myself who have already decided what's the point. And actually, that wasn't a flippant remark. They really felt that way. And actually, they had a right to feel that way, because we know that people with criminal records are subjected to all sorts of structural barriers and stigma. And so then I kind of went back to my university, did my master's dissertation on the kind of how we came up with this idea of the juvenile delinquent. And I suppose it was a more theoretical piece, but it was about how did that even come into our public consciousness, this idea of the antisocial young person. And
that's interesting.
And it was, I really enjoyed it, and I did a piece on that, and then had some conversations with staff at Keele at the time, and they said, well, have you thought about trying to research this? And so then we went away, put in a research proposal, and I was very lucky to get funded by Keele University. So then that set off that kind of trajectory.
Got you.
Wow.
Did you find it interesting that age 10 is the age of criminality in the UK?
Yes.
And it's one of the youngest.
One of the lowest.
In Europe.
Yeah, and obviously that was influenced by the Jamie Bolger case.
Yeah.
Which again is really interesting, isn't it? When we have these crimes that really grip the public imagination, and get people angry, and then people demand more punitive sanctions without really, I would argue, thinking about the people that's going to impact.
Yeah.
Another example, kind of just linking to criminal records, is the Soham murders. So the murders of Jessica Chapman and Holly Wells by a caretaker. Yeah, and after that, we had a real, we had the development of the Police National Database for one, and we had the Bitchard inquiry that said basically Ian Huntley had slipped through the net. And so we needed to invest a lot of money and infrastructure, kind of digital infrastructure, into better sharing of criminal record information. And now the consequences of that we're seeing today when it comes to criminal records. But it's just, you're saying about criminal age of responsibility, is it's these really kind of awful crimes, obviously, but then the way that they influence legislation and policy is really significant.
And it's almost like one person does, or like a handful of people do something really bad, but then legislation is brought in that taints and affects the lives of so many.
Absolutely.
And that's I think that's something that's not really considered, because if a 10-year-old is not old enough to purchase alcohol, how are they old enough to... Of course, young children that age understand the difference between right and wrong for the most part.
Yeah.
But to be able to put a label on them as a criminal from such a young age, and that shapes their minds. That's why when you're meeting them at the age of 19, you're talking to a young person, but inside they're very old. They just feel like, what's the point? We were talking to someone like that yesterday. Slightly different circumstances, but it's very common because their society already molds it and labels them. It becomes quite hard. Yeah. But you seem very passionate. I love this. So talk to us about your PhD, constructing and maintaining a non-criminal identity.
Yeah, so the PhD was a very exploratory piece of research. And what I wanted to look at was, how do people experience living with a criminal record? It was very, very broad. And what I wanted to do was not just focus on prison leavers, because, I mean, if we think about criminology, as soon as I say to somebody, oh, I'm a criminology lecturer, it's, oh, so like murder. Yeah. And I'm like, oh, no, criminal records. And automatically I'm losing their interest at this point. And then they go, oh, right, so like people in prison. And I'm like, oh, no,
Not quite.
not really. And
Regular
again,
people.
and then I've really lost them.
Yeah.
And so, but for me, it was about, there's 12.3 million people living in the UK with a criminal record at the moment. The vast majority of these people have not been to prison. They have not experienced incarceration. Now, that's not to say they haven't experienced the exclusionary effects of having engaged with the criminal justice system and haven't experienced the consequences of a criminal record. But it means that a lot of the research and literature that we have around rehabilitation and assistance just doesn't really apply to these people, because they are people who have historical minor cautions and convictions who are having to navigate that. And so I thought, well, actually, the dominant literature around prison leavers doesn't work. So what does work?
So just picking up on where we left, could you please talk to us about your PhD, constructing and maintaining a non-criminal identity?
Of course, yeah. So as I said, I finished it last year.
Okay.
And it was a really exploratory piece of research in that I wanted to just understand a little bit more about what it's like to live with a criminal record in England and Wales.
Okay.
So live under that kind of Rehabilitation of Offenders Act and filtering rules that dictates when and where you need to disclose your criminal record. Okay. But it kind of spiraled into something much bigger that ended up being about the narratives of people, the stories they shared, and about the kinds of identities that they constructed with me. And by that, I mean the people who I spoke to had mainly had historical or minor cautions and convictions. Okay. So these were people who had never been incarcerated and never had that experience, and therefore, actually, their voices are missing in most of criminological literature, because most of criminology looks at desistance and looks at rehabilitation, focusing predominantly on those people who have effectively been taken away from mainstream society, placed into an institution, and then are supposed to be kind of released and reintegrated into society. And so that's kind of where the attention is at the moment. And I thought, well, okay, there's 12.3 million people living in the UK with a criminal record. The vast majority have never had that experience of incarceration, but actually the exclusionary effects of the criminal record are still felt. And so I wanted to look at that. And as I said, it then became very much about their non-criminal identity, in that most of the people that I spoke to were very clear that they did not consider themselves a criminal. Okay. Perhaps they had committed an offence, but largely that was for a kind of a range of reasons. Whether that be I was a young lad growing up in Thatcher's Liverpool, whether that was I was experiencing domestic violence or experiencing a kind of hostile household and other forms of trauma and victimization. But that was one part of their life story. Of course, yeah. And so actually that didn't, for them, shouldn't have placed the label of criminal upon them. And so my research was very much about, well, having had that label attached to you, how do you navigate that? And also, where does the criminal record manifest? Okay. So a lot of the attention, again, within this field is around employment. Now, there's clear reasons for that. I mean, employment is fundamental to have that kind of quality of life and standard of living, to have financial security. It's fundamental to everybody. And for that reason, employment has dominated the field. But I was thinking, well, how does it impact on people's families' lives? Their ability to engage perhaps with their children's schools, to go on holidays, to kind of travel. And these different kind of ways that it manifests, kind of going into higher education, for example. So I wanted to do a piece of work that was very, very open. So the only question that I asked in my interviews was, could you tell me about your life with a criminal record? Okay. Most people obviously look at you and go, what do you want to hear? Where do you want me to start? And I just kind of sit back and go, just
tell me your story.
Talk to me about your life. And then in the second interview, because I interviewed 14 people twice. Okay. The second interview, I might say, so you mentioned this in the first interview. Could you tell me some more about that? Okay. But I was careful not to prompt for specific things that I found interesting. Okay. Because I wanted to know what they found important. So very, very kind of exploratory in that way.
So you know how you mentioned about people and some of the criminal records, there's some people that their criminal records can never be removed. Have you ever spoken to people like that as well? And what's the experience been like?
Yes, actually in the UK, there is no mechanism for criminal records to become expunged. So quite often in the UK, we like to compare ourselves to America and go, well, at least we're not that bad, right? That's the common thing that we do to justify anything that's actually problematic, particularly when it comes to our criminal justice system. But actually, even in America, you can have, in particular states, particularly a youth criminal record, a juvenile criminal record will be taken off, it'll be expunged. Whereas in England and Wales, it will always remain on there. So until an individual reaches 100 years old, okay, that information will be stored on the police national computer.
For life, essentially.
For life,
100 years old.
And in theory, you can apply to have that information reviewed, to be reviewed and removed, but there's only a handful of examples where that's actually been successful. And largely you have to demonstrate that the information is inaccurate, or that perhaps there was an issue when it came to the sentencing or the kind of mechanisms of justice, I suppose. So actually for an individual who did do whatever it was that's on their record, that will stay on there. And I mentioned briefly earlier you've got the Rehabilitation of Offenders Act and filtering rules, which give some degree of legal protection to these people by saying, well, after a period of time, you don't have to disclose it. But there's so many occupations that are exempt from that. So actually, it's if you want to work in a school, if you want to be an accountant, right? If you want to be a taxi driver. So there's so many different occupations. And actually, a lot of the time what we're seeing, or what we think we're seeing anyway, it's hard to know without the research, but the vast majority of DBS checks that are conducted every year are enhanced, and they will show your unspent and your spent. And potentially information, so your soft data, so that could be
from the police,
that could be an arrest with no further action. It could be an acquittal, right? And that could show up on that DBS check. So even though we do have legal protections in place, we love the data, and it seems to be that people want to know that information. And so I think there's a gap in research now to actually kind of go and talk to employers and go, well, why do you feel you need that information? And when you have that information, what do you do with it? Is it a knee-jerk, I need to protect my colleagues, I need to protect my customers, or whatever? Or there's this risk thing going on? Is it that they misunderstand the law and they feel that they cannot employ this person anymore? I don't know. But yeah, what we do know is that I think it was 75% of checks each year are enhanced. And so because these records can't be expunged, well, then they're going to keep coming up. So it really ends up being this kind of lifelong sentence almost, really, for people living with historical, even minor convictions and cautions.
And I think employers sometimes conduct those checks, but they're not supposed to. So some employers actually don't know. And it doesn't help when the individual themselves don't know. So they go through these checks, and employers are making decisions on information that they really shouldn't have. That's one. Absolutely. And something I say to our participants as well is, you may have interactions with the police and they may NFA to take no further action. But if you have several of these, when a DBS is conducted and there's several incidents, and some employees, because they're not going to tell you their thought process, because that could be discrimination, but they will possibly take all of these NFA'd incidents into consideration when making a decision. When you see somebody with such a long list compared with somebody who doesn't, who's going to be the do you see?
So absolutely. And I think, I mean, on that first point, I think you've got not only do the people with criminal records have to become experts, right? These are everyday people who all of a sudden have to become expert in quite complicated legislation, right? They then have to learn when do they legally have to disclose it and when they're allowed to legally conceal it, which in itself comes with issues. But then the employer, they may think that they're doing the right thing. because there is limited training. I mean, Unlock, which is a national charity, I know that they have training courses. I think, but I'm not sure, but I'm pretty sure I've seen Working Chance, another national charity, do training courses for employers. But these are employers who are actively taking part in training. Okay. What about the employers who aren't?
That's right.
Who think they're doing the right thing, but are actually probably getting enhanced DBS checks when they're only legally allowed basic?
That's right.
And at the start of my PhD, I did some reading actually on the DBS, and the DBS says that it's a facilitator of information sharing, but it is not accountable for the use of that information. That is for the employers themselves. And I couldn't see, and I don't know if anybody else out there who listens to this has the information, please do contact me because I'm really interested in this. I couldn't see any examples where they call them kind of umbrella bodies and registered bodies had their right to put in DBS requests taken away from them. So I'm like, either that means everybody's doing it all right, okay, or it means there's no checking mechanism going on. And well, who's doing the checking? And again, I couldn't see anything in place to be checking that.
Gotcha.
And so I think then it's down for the individual with the criminal record to know, oh, I'm being illegally asked to disclose and therefore I'm going to do something about it. Or, well, I don't really know. Or even if they do know that they're being asked to disclose when legally they're not supposed to, well, they'll probably just shy away and go, this is going to be bad for me if I kick off and I'm going to step away and I'm going to apply somewhere else. So that, so it does become just a real problem for people. And as I said, even those who can legally withhold their criminal record, well, then they're then working. And some of the people who I spoke to said exactly this. Well, I've now lied. And particularly people who we know, people who interact with the criminal justice system tend to go on, I say tend to, that's an overstretch, but a lot of people do go on to work within criminal justice related charities or periphery organizations. And so for these people, it's kind of like, God, I'm lying to people and I'm trying to use my experience kind of covertly for good in the work that I do. But what if somebody was to find out? And somebody who I spoke to said that to me, and they said, I know they wouldn't care about my criminal record, but they would probably care that I hid it from them because we're friends now, right? We're friends, we're colleagues, we have that relationship. And it's too late for me to tell them now, really. But actually, I did nothing wrong by withholding it. That was my legal right to do so. So even that puts people in a really kind of sticky position.
Share some of the stories of those who you have met and have been affected by the criminal record.
Yeah, absolutely. I think actually this is the best way to try to illustrate just how complicated it is. So, I mean, one of the people who I spoke to, who I gave the name Sally in the thesis, she was in her 60s at the time of the interview, and she had a conviction, for possession of cannabis when she was in her 20s, living in student accommodation. And in her interview, she kind of quipped that the drug squad had nothing better to do because it was a very rural area. And so there was a flat raid, and she said that at the time a lot of student houses were getting busted, essentially. She went to court, she was given a non-custodial sentence and put on probation, and she had to pay a fine. She was already studying a course on librarianship at the time, so instantly she knew, well, this is going to impact my career now. And so for a period of time, she did lie. She illegally withheld her conviction, believing that actually no one's going to know. This isn't a major thing. What's the harm? And she was caught out at one point lying, and she had to have a meeting about it. But she did manage to keep her job. And from then on, she did disclose every single time. And she said that the older she got, and she was still working at the time that I spoke to her, and nearing retirement. And she said, I have to sit there and be asked by people in their 20s who are looking at me, and I'm in my 60s, and they ask me, so what would you do if a student asked you for drugs? Wow. And she said, she was like, I can see that they're embarrassed by it. I'm embarrassed by it. But still, 40 years on.
Oh, wow.
And that was just in employment. And then she started telling me that she had visited America with her partner for many, many times. She got friends out there. And she logged on to get the visa, and it was rejected. And she thought, this is odd. I've never had that rejected before. And she went and she had to have an interview at the embassy in London. And she said, I was back on trial again, and I was being questioned about my conviction again. And I had to explain to them, I've got all these years experience working in school. I've been to America several times before. And she said, well, hey, it's Donald Trump. And that's what she said. She said, he doesn't like criminals, doesn't like Muslims. That's how she quipped about it. And she was very kind of trying to make jokes throughout the interview, but you could tell she was really distressed by it. She was granted a waiver of eligibility, which means that she could then go to America. But when she landed in America, she was pulled aside and interrogated. She was separated from her partner, taken into an interview room, and she was really, really interrogated about whether or not she was carrying drugs, about her past conviction, and so on. And this is a lady who's got serious health issues anyway. And she just said it just triggered everything for her, and it set off her mental health issues. And she came back. They stayed out there for a period of time, and she came back. And she said to me and my partner had planned our retirement around travel. And now not only do I not think I'm going to be able to do that, but my partner is now being punished for possession of cannabis when I was in my 20s.
Wow.
What?
So I think that's a really nice example just to show how, and she said for years I thought it was just going to be an employment that I'd have to deal with this. But now it's not just employment, it's my retirement. And a couple of other people who I spoke to spoke about being either parents or grandparents and wanting to take their children to Disneyland, right? We see the adverts. It's very much your child's only a child once, and you've got to make these memories while you can. This kind of real emotional advert that says, if you take them to Disneyland, this is going to be a priceless memory forever. But they said, well, I can't because I have to get my visa. So one participant, she said to me about the day that she did put in for a visa, and her DBS certificate came through the post. And she said, I'd been reading on forums about what to expect, and they said, oh, it's just a piece of paper and you send it off. And hers came through her letterbox in her family home, and it was 2 pieces of paper. So instantly she thought, oh. And then her partner, obviously, who knew bits and bobs, turned around and went, oh my God, like, what is this? Because I think you mentioned earlier, that piece of paper tells a very specific narrative about somebody. It takes out all the context, and it just has this list of all these things that doesn't match that person. And she said that her partner was shocked, and she had to then explain, well, I told you. And he was like, well, yeah, I know, but come on, man. Like, I didn't. So then she said that they're a really great relationship, and it was fine, but that interaction was horrible for her. And she said that she sent that off, and she was granted the visa, but that she couldn't bring herself to take her daughter away, because she said, what happens if I'm separated from my child at the airport, interrogated and sent home? She was like, I am not traveling with my young child knowing there is a chance that I'm going to be taken away from her in the airport by security and interrogated. And after the interview ended, we were having a conversation. And she said, like, have you heard of that happening? And I said, and I couldn't obviously say kind of anything about the participants, but I was like, I have heard that happening, yes. And so your theory is valid, right?
It's just sad because it's like this is like trauma. It's like you've been through this, you're trying to change, but you've changed, but it's something that just constantly keeps following you. And it does it say, like, because it says someone's been out of prison for like 20 years. You know, like you mentioned about the story of the woman getting arrested in like, what was it, in immigration or something like that. So do they not see that she's been clean for, do they not consider that? Or
no, it's just, here's your criminal record, you are a potential risk, and we have to deal with that risk.
Potential risk.
So it's very it strips people of of their identity. Here's what it says on paper, and so now we're going to treat you accordingly. And it's really, really problematic. And then when it comes to people trying to explain that, somebody else who I spoke to, she got her criminal record at a time when she was living in foster care, and she explained there was lots of older men involved in her life at the time. There was lots of kind of drugs going on, and she had a series of offences. And she said now, I'm in a professional occupation. And when I go for an interview, I've got to juggle the fact that when I explain my criminal record, I'm trying to be a professional whilst trying to explain some of the worst parts of my life because I was a victim and I had experienced layers of victimization and trauma. And how do I juggle that in an interview when I'm trying to get a job? Because I have to explain to some extent that I was experiencing these issues because that's the story behind my criminal record, right? And that's what the employer needs to know is why.
That's right.
Is this you or is this kind of, you know... And she said, but how do I do that when I'm trying to be professional and get a job? And other people spoke to me about how kind of they'd had a job for a period of time and then they'd gone for a promotion or perhaps their job role had changed or they'd been taken over by another company.
And they have to go through the process.
And then they go through it and all of a sudden, their line manager, their colleagues who had no idea, all of a sudden you're having to disclose it, particularly to the line manager. And I had one person, she was a social worker and she was applying for a promotion and she said, I remember vividly, I was having the interview for my promotion and it was my line manager who I knew we had a good relationship. And I was in the interview and there was the question, do you have a criminal record or whatever the wording was? And she said, she went and she said to her line manager, she put her pen and it hovered over the no box. And as she went to tick no, she had to go, oh no, actually, I do have a criminal record. And there was that moment of,
wow,
I didn't know you had a criminal record and I've been your line manager for this many years.
It wasn't relevant.
Yeah. And then she had to go into it. But because the position that she was getting a promotion for did require that background check, she then had to disclose it. So it is really complicated. And it's about the message of the criminal record as well. So one person who I spoke to had been incarcerated. He referred to himself as a career criminal throughout.
Wow.
Yeah, he was like, I've been in and out of prison. But he said, he was like, I was just young and dumb.
Of course.
But he said there was one offence on his criminal record that's a violent offence. And he said, that's not me. I was in a bar at New Year's Eve. A fight kicked out. I'd been released from my second custodial sentence only a couple of months prior. I knew the police were coming and I had to get out because if I was found there during the fight, and he said, but the only way out was to fight your way out. And he said, so yeah, I threw a punch. But I was trying to get out because I knew if the police turned up and saw me there, I was going to be back in prison. And he was. He was arrested. And he said, he was like, I am an ex-con. I'm a career criminal. So what? I have no shame. I was young. I was dumb. I was prattling around, essentially. He said, but I am not a violent ex-con. But my criminal record tells me I am. And I have to reconcile that. And when I meet a new partner, I have to explain that I'm not a violent ex-con. So it's not even just the criminal record, it's the message of the criminal record and the particular stigma that conveys. Yeah, I mean, another one of my participants spoke to me about how she had a caution for neglect. She was experiencing domestic violence and she was outside. Her children were asleep upstairs and she was sat outside in the kind of front yard, I suppose, with her friend. And her ex-partner turned up. Her and her friend was having a drink and he came up to them and she ran because she knew that he'd never hurt the kids, but he could hurt her. So she fled and he phoned the police and said that he'd turned up and that the children were asleep upstairs and mum was nowhere to be found. She was arrested. She'd had a drink and so that was then used against her. He used that against her as well. And she had a caution for neglect. And she was like, imagine having to explain to employers, to partners, that I, as a mother, have a caution for neglect. So there's layers and layers, and it's not just about getting a job. It's not just about travel. It's about how it really shapes people's sense of belonging, how it really shapes how people feel that they can interact. So people talking about like, when I meet new people and I'm forming friendships, I have to be very vague about my past because giving too much detail, they'll figure it out. So it's just got these real lifelong kind of consequences for people in lots of different life domains.
What's about the chapter Gender and Criminal Records, please?
Yeah, so this was a chapter that I wrote. It appears in a handbook, so a big wedge of a book. I think there's like over 50 chapters in it, all written by different people. And the idea behind the book itself, which was Isla Masson and Natalie Booth's kind of project, was that criminology is dominated by male voices. And by that, I mean most of the people who interact with the criminal justice system historically have been men. And so much of the research, a lot of what we know about experiences of, say, incarceration, resistance, rehabilitation, is all based on studies with men. Likewise, academia for a long time was very, very male dominated. And so it was, again, a lot of male voices. And so there's this real push now to look at, well, how does gender, how does race, how do different aspects of identity influence how people experience things? And that's not to say that women's experiences are worse than men's or whatever, or to construct any of those kinds of straw man arguments, but it's different, it's distinct. And so we need to look into it. So the chapter that I did was about how gender impacts the way that criminal records are experienced. I tried to keep my PhD out of this, really, because I was still writing my PhD at the time. So it was very much based on other research that exists, and I tried to pull it all together, because there is some stuff out there, but what we hadn't seen was a piece that, like I just said, kind of pulls it all together and tries to figure out what it looks like when taken in that way. And what the chapter is about then is kind of posing a question and saying that we need to look at more. So because the research that we have got demonstrates that there are gendered implications here. So I kind of drew on one study that was done based on CVs. So putting out different CVs and seeing what employers' reactions was. Did they get called for an interview or not? And what that found was that having a criminal record negatively impacted it. So you're less likely to get called for an interview. But it was gendered, and actually there was ethnicity there as well, because Black women in particular were less likely to get called back for the interview. So even though all women, so white women, Black women, were disadvantaged by their criminal records, actually it was Black women in particular who were less likely to be called for an interview.
When did you identify this?
So this was somebody else's research, that I was citing in the book. And I'd drawn another person's research that showed in America that Hispanic women in particular were considered unreliable hire, was the phrase, due to stereotypes around kind of large families, engagement with drugs, and offending due to basically gang membership and drugs. So I thought, well, what does this actually mean for, say, my research? And so I wrote that chapter, and then I went back to my work. And in my thesis, there's a chapter on narratives of trauma and victimization, but actually the kind of emotional burden of having to continue to go back to this. If we know that pathways to offending for women are different than they are for men, if we know that a lot of the time when women offend, it might be due to experiences of trauma, victimization, deprivation, being the kind of the sole carer in the household, and those kinds of pressures. If we already know that, then we know that when you sit down to a woman and say, why have you got this criminal record? Well, that's a different conversation than when you sit down to a man, for example, and say, well, and they can kind of go, well, I was a bit of a lad. I was a bit of a lad and I did this. And it's like the same kind of discourses, and that's what we call it, kind of the same discourses don't exist for women, because the right story for women to get that kind of empathy and understanding is, oh, you're a victim. And I think I kind of moved away from the chapter, I suppose, a little bit. But so the book chapter was very much about trying to find all the literature, and there isn't much, I have to admit, but try to locate the different literature that does exist on gender and ethnicity and criminal records and pull it together into one chapter so that I can kind of go, there's not much, but there is enough here to show that we need more research on it. So it was kind of starting a conversation, I suppose, was the purpose of that chapter. And that's something that I want to continue to do, is to look at kind of how different aspects of identity will influence how people experience their criminal records.
That sounds good. Because I think if you do more research into it, you'll definitely find there's similar experiences, but there's probably some key distinctions in the gender issue. So, okay.
And you in like your interviews, did you interview females as well during
so it was a self-selected sample, and by that I mean I put out my call for participants, and as long as they were 25 and over, living within a particular radius of where I was, because I was a kind of lone researcher, and they had one or more non-custodial cautions or convictions from 25 or under, I was happy to interview them.
Okay.
And so it actually ended up being pretty much a 50-50 split between men and women.
Okay.
It was a very white sample. So my kind of reflections on ethnicity are very, very minor. I mention it throughout, but I didn't feel that I had enough to actually make any kind of big kind of discussion there. But yes, it was kind of around kind of 50-50 split in terms of men and women, and just through pure luck, I had a few people in their 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s and 60s. So what I kind of want to look at, and what I'm really interested in, is how the criminal record changes throughout the life course. So not only does it shape the kind of opportunities you're likely to have, but when you become a mother, does that make you think differently? And how does the stigma of the criminal record affect you? When you become a grandfather and all of a sudden you want to take or you want to go and volunteer with your grandchild's school and you can't, well, actually all of a sudden your criminal record means something different now. It's the sense of injustice is perhaps greater, like when you're trying to retire with your partner in the case of Sally. So there's gender, there's ethnicity, there's age. Like the criminal record is ultimately, it's a piece of paper, right? But the way that it manifests in people's lives and the way that it shapes people's lives and their sense of self and belonging, it's really profound. And so that chapter kind of, I suppose, tries to demonstrate it through other people's research and just pose the question, and then the work that I'm doing or want to go on to do now is going to hopefully keep building on that.
Okay. So going on to the final question.
Yeah.
So if you had a magic wand, what changes would you make to the current criminal record system? What would you do?
I think for me, it needs a major reform, which is never, I suppose it's a bit of a rubbish answer in a way, but we need to really cut back on the way that we use criminal record information. And there are other ways to do it. And there was a special edition published recently which looked at different ways that different countries do criminal records. And so we know there are other ways to do it. And so we have options, right? So if we know that there is no checking mechanism really in the DBS to make sure that they aren't being kind of used illegally or disproportionately, well, then we even need to put one in. But I would argue, kind of better yet, why don't we change it? So rather than have that piece of paper that documents a very specific decontextualized narrative of somebody, why do we have that? We don't need it, right? So I think it's in the Netherlands, and don't get me wrong, there are problems with how it works there as well. But in the Netherlands, they have what they call a certificate of conduct. So if you're applying for work, you will then, so let's say you're applying to be a social worker. You then apply for your certificate of conduct. If you get it, that means there was nothing on your record that makes you inappropriate or whatever for that particular role. Doesn't mean you might have a criminal record, who knows? The employer never gets to know whether you have a criminal record or not. Now, as I said, there are lots of issues with that system as well, so I'm not kind of putting that on a pedestal to say it's perfect. But it does make me think, well then, why do we have this piece of paper that documents everything? So for me, I think there's been changes to the ROA, the Rehabilitation of Offenders. There's been changes to filtering. They don't go far enough.
Not far.
No, and Unlock are doing a lot of work trying to keep continuing to kind of campaign for changes. But for me, I think we need to change that piece of paper. It's putting people's history, a particular version of their history, on a piece of paper with a logo and a hologram, very, very official, very formal. It's putting that narrative on a piece of paper and asking somebody to then go and discuss it with someone. That's the problem for me. So I think we need to think particularly about that, and that's the kind of stuff that I want to go on and write about and look at more, is problematizing this piece of paper that carries so much weight and power.
I can actually follow people across borders, like 40 years later. Lots of people do crazy things at the age of 20.
And
to think about that following them into the age of 60, retirement age 65, it's crazy.
And the criminal justice system, it's supposed to be based on justice, so proportionality and fairness. And I think, if anything, this podcast is showing is that the way that we deal with criminal records is far from proportionate or fair at the moment.
Thank you. You've summarised that very well.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Until next time.
Thank you so much.
You
Thank you.
Take care.